Hello and welcome to the University of Maryland's Immersive Media Design Department third tutorial in Reaper. This tutorial will be covering effects, how to apply them, how to tweak them, how to route and automate them. This tutorial is building off of a previous tutorial on how to edit clips. So if you have not done that one yet, you may want to go back and check it out. But if you already know how to edit clips, all you need is to bring in some audio files and you should be able to follow along. So I've got Reaper open and you can see my previous project. And this is a project in which I took an existing song, sliced it up, and played with the speed, pitch, and in some cases reversed samples from that original song, and created an entirely new song, which is a lot more ambient than the original. And so in this tutorial, I will be applying effects to each of these tracks in order to further distance this remix of the song to make it sound as unrecognizable from the original as I possibly can. All the effects I will be teaching today are very common effects in audio production, and you can access them both in DAWs like Reaper, but also in other multimedia programs with video editing software like Premiere, animation software like After Effects, and even gaming engines like Unity. So right now we're looking at the original project and we have what might be considered dry tracks, tracks with no effects on them. All of the editing has been done directly to the clips, and so we're working with completely untreated audio, much like you would if you had recorded these instruments or created musical samples using digital instruments. So to start, I've made a copy of that original Reaper file, just so I always have a backup in case I completely mess things up or Reaper crashes during my production. So to clean this up a bit more and make things easier to work with, I'm going to click anywhere in my workspace here, and I'm going to hit Control-A on Windows or Command-A on Mac, and that is going to select all. That shortcut can be used in lots of different programs. That is typically the standard for select all when you're working with media. And you'll notice that these clips are in either loops, like this one here, with these notches indicating the loop, or they're separate tracks which have been faded together as indicated by these red areas here. But what I'm going to do is turn these into new files, and each of these is going to be a single track, removing these looping notches or fades so that these are standalone audio files. And I'm going to do that by right-clicking on any of them and coming down here to glue items, similar to how I did in the previous tutorial, except I'm doing this to all of my items. And it's going to glue those items, and gluing, again, just means it's going to turn them into new standalone files. As you can see, all those fades and notches have disappeared, and as I'm editing, I am only going to be editing single files. And that's just to make things easier, because I know that I've got a backup, and it's less visual interference, and now I'm not likely to accidentally nudge a clip in a way that I didn't mean to do. In addition to that, to further clean things up, I'm going to group these last three tracks because they are from the same recording, just pitched differently, so that they are harmonizing with one another. And in order to group them, I'm going to click on the track above, hit Control-T or Command-T for you Mac users, and that's going to create a new track over here, a blank track. And if I select my three tracks by clicking on one and then shift-clicking onto the last one, that will select everything in the middle. I'll click and drag these up onto the track above, and you'll see that there's this thick blue line. And as I drag sort of towards the middle of that track, that blue line is going to nudge over to the right, indicating that these tracks are going to go into that track. So we've created children tracks, and they're going to have a parent or master track. And now an arrow has appeared in the top left, indicating that this is a grouped track, which I will name grouped mid, because there are lots of mid-range tones in these. So I'm going to title that, and I'm just going to hit this arrow to shrink the track. And so now in our group track, you can see a combination of all of the waves within the track. So you can see these are the waveforms, and they are all being added together to make a grouped waveform. Now we're working with a much cleaner looking file, which isn't completely necessary, but it just makes our workflow simpler. So now I'm going to take a brief second to listen to each of the tracks just to understand their characteristics. So we can solo this group, and it will solo every track within that group, so we're only hearing all of the tracks in this group. So that track sounds like it's got some nice mid-range frequencies. There's not too much bass, not too much treble. We're sort of in the middle of the human hearing range. Let's check on this track. Now this track's a bit more percussive, but I'm also hearing more high-end frequencies. They're higher pitched frequencies. And finally, the bass track. Much lower frequencies are going on in this clip. So how do we emphasize that frequency range? Well, the perfect place to start in audio mixing is through equalization, or EQ. And that is the first effect we will explore. To do so, we'll click on this button here that has the letters FX and a power button icon. And after clicking that, it's opened up this menu. And this menu contains every effect that I have access to in Reaper. Some of these are built in and native to Reaper. They come with the program, which is very convenient for us, and which is what I will be focusing on today. Some of them are third-party plugins. So we've got digital instruments and effects by other companies. But all the Reaper effects are going to have the company name Kakos. So you'll see each effect labeled in a distinct way. First, you have the type of signal processing. The most common is probably VST, or Virtual Sound Technology. There's also JS, which stands for Jesusonic, which is a different type of signal processing software. Then you'll have the name of the effect, and each name will kind of tell you what that effect does. If you do enough audio editing, you will eventually learn what each name means. Finally, between the parentheses, you will see the name of the company that created it. Kakos is Reaper's company. And so all of the open source effects will have that label on it. And in some cases, you will have the amount of channels that the effect can use. So here we have mono, but here we have 16 channels. Over here on the left-hand side, you have different arrangements of the same effects, so you can narrow them down in different ways. So for example, we can narrow things down to all plugins. So all plugins groups everything by their signal processing. So you can see categories like DX, VST, and JS as catch-alls. And if you see I next to any of these, it typically means that that is an instrument, a software instrument, like a synth or sound font-based MIDI instrument. You can also narrow things down to categories, which can be very helpful if you're trying to work quickly. You've got things like delay, distortion, modulation, pitch correction, etc. And then you can view things by developer. So if you've just downloaded Reaper, you will likely only see Kakos, which shows you the built-in effects that come pre-installed in Reaper. And you'll notice that Reaper tends to label all of their effects with REA at the beginning of them. So if you're searching for effects, that's an easy way to find your built-in native Reaper effects. Just type RE, and that'll go ahead and narrow things down. But then if you follow it with whatever effect you're looking for, EQ, that will completely isolate that effect. And so as I said, I wanted to add EQ. And so I'm going to double click here, and it will open up this window, the FX window. And here we can see any effect that has been added is going to pop up here. So if I were to just randomly add some more, you are going to see the effects populate here on the left-hand side. And keep in mind that the order of effects will determine the sound, which is why this is referred to as an effects chain. And I'm just going to get rid of those so we can fully focus on EQ. So over here, we've got our effects workspace. And many effects come with some sort of graphical indicator and some sliders or knobs. Many effects also come with a list of presets. Some of them don't, but the well-made ones do. And these presets are a great way to get started with an effect, especially when you're just getting familiar with audio mixing. So I often recommend selecting a preset and then tweaking its parameters after it's loaded in. And so I am working with this track, and I know I'm working with that track because after I added the effects button became green to indicate that this track has active effects on it. And I know that this track is the one that had more bass frequencies in it. So I'm going to select a preset that is aimed at highlighting the bass. You'll notice several drum presets here, some vocals throughout, some guitar amp presets, and a few other random ones sprinkled in. But the effect I want for this very deep bass is going to be what's called a low pass filter. And what that means is it's going to block any high frequencies in the recording from ever reaching the speakers, but it will let the bass frequencies pass through so that the listener is only hearing those bass frequencies in the recordings. And although this instrument is a bass, like all instruments, there is a huge range of frequencies when that instrument is played. But the high-pitched frequencies of a bass are very weak. And so by cutting them out, we clean up the audio so that the higher pitched instruments can really shine through. So you'll notice that selecting bass low pass has sort of transformed our workspace, but we're still getting the same visual that we're getting. It's just expanded in a different way for our convenience. Down here at the bottom, we can see the frequencies in hertz. So the lower the frequency, the lower or more bassy the sound. Often in recordings, each track will be designated. So frequencies between 20 hertz and 60 hertz are considered sub-bass. 60 to 250 are considered bass, and 250 to 500 are considered low mids. So that's the range that our bass really comes through. And then up on the left-hand side, we can see the amplitude of each of those frequencies. So I'm going to solo this track, so we're fully focused on it. And then I'm going to hit the space bar, and that is going to get our audio playing. So once your audio is playing, you'll notice a yellow line wiggling across the screen. And this is indicating the frequencies of the track and what amplitudes they reach. So you'll notice this is a fairly complex looking line. It's very wiggly. Like most natural sounds, this audio track has complex layers of frequencies. It's not just a single one. And this EQ gives us a nice visual of those frequencies in action. You'll also notice this transparent cyan area. Throughout this area, the EQ is blocking all of the higher pitched tones from coming through. So anything that's covered in this blue means we can't hear those frequencies. I can move this area by clicking and dragging this low pass circle, which is labeled 4. And now those high-pitched frequencies can come through fully. And with this clip, most of the high-pitched frequencies are coming from the plucking of the strings. That's what we hear. But the dominant tones are all in the bass range, from sub-bass to low mids, which ends at about 500 hertz here. So we don't necessarily need all of this. We can fade out all of the super high-pitched ones because that pluck could sort of interfere with other sounds in our mix. So I'm just going to drag that back to where it was. And because this curve is sort of intersecting our frequency line right here, this will sort of be, we're muting this a bit. That means we're muting this area a bit. So it's not completely muted like over here on the right, but it's not at its normal amplitude from the original recording. And now those plucks are dulled out. We can't hear the distinct high frequencies of them. So I'm going to close that and move on to our next track, our higher pitch track. So clicking on the FX button is going to bring up that FX window, and I am going to select again, Re-EQ. And so you'll notice that we're back to this default EQ visualizer to contrast our previous low-pass filter visualizer. And that's because the low pass is muting out all of the higher frequencies, so we don't need as complex an interface because it's solely focused on limiting things to a specific area. But the default EQ allows you for more complex EQing. So first you'll notice we've got more nodes here. We can even increase the amount of nodes by saying add band, and it will add numbered bands to your EQ. And a lot of the presets actually have more than 4 bands. So, for example, the snare has 4 active bands, but 11 bands total. So I'm going to play this track. So you can see the yellow frequency band. And you'll notice that there are lots of fine details of peaks and valleys, but we've also got patterns in the larger scale. So you can see sort of this hill forming here, dips down again, but then a bit of a hill there that dips down again here, and then it raises back up out to the bass. And that's because the characteristic of this recording has a decent amount of bass frequencies, a little less low to mid frequencies, but then it picks back up in the high mid frequencies from about 3 kilohertz to 6, and then it falls back down in the presence frequencies above 4 kilohertz. And then what's often referred to as brilliance, there's a little bit, but not all that much. You'll notice our blue areas are amplifying or muting certain areas of our frequency band. And I chose snare because I thought the sound sounded a bit like the frequencies of a snare drum. I wasn't completely right. For example, this 9 can come down here. It doesn't need to be amplified as much as the tones in this area. But it does give us a good start. Because we don't have that many frequencies up here, I can activate band 11 by checking enabled down here. And then I can drag that down. And you'll notice that that is forming a band that has a bell-shaped curve. It drops down from the left side, but then pops back up on the right. And that's because our band type is set to band. But because I don't even have any frequencies up here to really clean things up, I can completely mute those out with, again, a low-pass filter. So you'll see a list of types here, and I'm going to select low-pass, because like our purely low-pass filter that we used for the bass, this is going to let all frequencies to the left of our visual indicator pass by, but anything on the other side will not pass through to the speakers. And you'll notice that this is kind of cruising all the way off our screen. Now we could keep that, and as we move, it's going to mathematically adjust based on the next band over. But I can also affect the shape of this, sometimes referred to as the Q, but here it is referred to as band width. And so if I make that wider, it's going to start dragging that shape down. And so by doing that, we can better match the way our frequencies are coming through. Now, we do have bass tones in this. Recording, but they're not completely necessary. I'd say where this recording is really pronounced is in those mid-high frequencies. So we can just cut out this bass so that our bass track can really shine through, and this track won't interfere with the powerful bass tones. So we'll do the opposite of what we did on the right side. I'll enable this again, and then I'll select a high-pass filter because we want anything higher than this area passing through. I'll also drag that over, and it will sort of merge with this bandpass. And I'm even going to mute this out a little more and move that over so that the bass, which occupies this area, will have plenty of room. Now for this final group, I'm going to make a frequency band that can complement the other two. So I'm going to highlight the frequencies that have been muted out, and I'm going to mute out the frequencies that are already being amplified in the other tracks. So add another EQ, and I'm going to pull up my other multi-band track. So I'm going to solo this now. And what I can do is pull up that snare preset, but do the opposite. And drag all of the peaks to valleys and all the valleys to peaks. And now when I close this and select all of my tracks, listen close and you may hear the difference. With the effects off and no EQ, the track ends up sounding flatter because we haven't cut out frequencies within each of our instruments. But as it gets turned on, you get more contrast between the tracks because we're amplifying distinct areas of each of them. Flat, accented, flat, accented. So that's EQ. But now let's get a little fancier and give our track more life with a little effect called reverb. We're going to approach this effect in a different way that we approached these individual EQs on every track, because I want every track to have reverb. Reverb is an effect that makes your audio sound like it was recorded in a different place than the original. You'll notice in a lot of recording studios they have foam on the walls, and that is to absorb the sound so you don't pick up the characteristics of the room that your audio was recorded in. Think of how different audio would sound if it was recorded in a bathroom stall versus a cathedral, a cave versus inside a car. Different locations sound different because the surfaces in those locations bounce sound waves in different ways. And so by applying reverb to our audio mix, we can make it sound like it was recorded in a completely different place. Now, of course, the audio I'm working with isn't directly from a recorded instrument. It's from a software instrument and has been edited into a more synthetic sound. But that helps with the point of reverb. We can make it sound like it was recorded in a cathedral, for example. So because I want each of my tracks to sound like they were recorded in the same place, they can share the same reverb effect. In fact, that will make it sound more realistic, because if each track had its own reverb, then the sound would be manipulated in different ways on each track, and that might not be realistic to how multiple sounds would sound in a space, because sound travels through surfaces in waves, and again, the surfaces in a location are going to affect how those waves bounce off of each other, and so multiple instruments will have waves that intersect each other, which will affect the overall sound. So I'm going to double click here on the bottom to make a new track, and I will title this Reverb. But this track is going to stay blank, and that's because it is purely a Master Effects track. And I'm going to send the signals from each of these tracks into the reverb track. The reverb track is a receive. And so you'll notice to the right of my volume bar is the route button. And if I click it, it opens up the routing menu. So because my reverb is a receiver, I want to look at the receives section. And if I click this drop down, it's going to detect every track in my project. And this is why naming your tracks comes in handy too. So I can see my original audio recording here. That's muted right now. But then I can see my first edited track. So I'm going to select my first edited track here, and it's going to create a receive from that track. So if I go up to that track and click the route button, it's going to now show me that this track is sending to my receive track, the reverb. And you'll notice a little user interface has opened up here, which includes things like mute, a volume knob, and a pan knob. And what this indicates is how much of your signal are you sending from your send track to your receive track. So that will make a little more sense after I've added the reverb effect. So I'm going to open up the reverb category, and I'm going to select REA Verbate, Reverbate. And that will open up an effects window with a different interface from the EQ because reverb has different parameters. And I'm going to solo my reverb track so I can hear the scent effect. And I'll start playing the track. So the signal has essentially doubled. This track is bringing in as much signal as the send track. So I'm going to open up the presets, and Dark Corridor sounds like it will be distinct. You can hear a little echo as that effect is applied. And so with this effect, it's as if it was recorded in a dark corridor. It sounds deeper, fuller, and so if I take the effect off, you'll probably notice. there's a bit of an echo in there too. And there's more sustain. So when I stop this track, you're going to hear it drag on. But if I deactivate the effect and stop it, you won't hear any sustain. So this is with the effect. Sustained. With no effect. Ends immediately. So I could change Dark Corridor to Discrete Room. Let's see how that sounds. Not as much sustain, a bit more muted. And Reverbate is a bit of a specific reverb effect because it targets different drums specifically. So the reverbs for this might really highlight certain things. But a lot of other reverbs will give you more options of locations, like small room, plate, cathedral. This reverb is more specific, directed at drums to really enhance them individually. But for now, I'm going to choose Dark Corridor just because I like that sustain. And the reason there's sustain is because and these two parameters, room size and dampening, contribute to that sustain. So by raising them, you can hear that's really dragging on. And that's because the sound has not been dampened at all. It's not slowly fading out. With no dampening and very small room size, no sustain. So I'll pump that back up. And there it is. And stereo width will make it feel as though that audio's been pushed out further into the speakers. It's sort of a sonic illusion. But that's what that does. An initial delay changes how long it takes for your reverberated signal to start. So if I set it much slower, there'll be a more gradual build. And I can even mute out the original dry track, and we'll hear just the reverb. So that's a bit overpowering, and I'm going to take the volume down a bit so the effect is a little more subtle. Now I'm going to route the other tracks into the reverb, because remember, we've only routed the first. And now you can hear that mechanical sounding second track coming through the reverb. And because that track has crisper high-mid sounds occurring, you can really hear the echo of the reverb in the background. So now all of our tracks are sending to the reverb. But it really feels a bit muddy with the high mids track contributing to the signal. So I'm going to open up its route menu, and I'm going to let less of this signal in. So we won't hear it as much in the reverb mix. So it's basically faded out once I get to -20. I'll bring it back up just so there's a little hint of it. And so through these sliders, which if you just open up the reverb's receive route menu to show its receive, you can see each track. So I can play with these each individually till I feel like the sound is right. So if I want to highlight more of the last track, I'll bring that up and bring the bass a bit down. And here's that effect. Not so low. And that really has some sustain now. And so now you can hear the track with reverb and without. With that sounds much more dry. And so adding reverb, a very spacious sounding reverb, has made our track sound a lot more dreamy, surreal, like it's in a landscape or some other world. And as I mentioned, you can add these types of effects directly in your application. So Unity, for example, has an audio mixer interface where you can add effects and route audio to different tracks. So if you're making a virtual reality application, you can mix the audio using proper techniques, and your experience will have a much more natural sonic experience of your work. Or maybe you want to make a program in Unity to make generative music. The audio mixer can help with that. So in the field of immersive media, knowing these techniques through a DAW can inform your practice in other areas. And most of these new media applications we use have a lot of overlap with things like effects and routing. But with what I've demonstrated here, these are just static effects. What if we wanted our effects to change over time, to move randomly, or change spatially? What if we were able to animate the effects, like using keyframes in an animation program, so that we have complete control over how those effects fade in and out? Both can be achieved through parameter modulation and automation. So let's take my middle track here. The one that sounds mechanical or like flapping wings or something. I want to add to that movement. So the first thing I might do to start is to play with the panning. Panning, as you might remember, is moving more of the audio signal to one speaker or the other. So as I turn this knob, this will move from right to left. But what if I wanted this to happen automatically, in an almost mathematical way, without needing to know any math? That's where we need parameter modulation. So I'm going to open up our FX menu here. And like I said, I want to dynamically pan. I want the panning to be dynamic. So I'm going to find a panning effect here. And I'm just going to select all plugins and say pan. And so I know this JS volume pan smoother gives us very basic controls, but just what we need. It has a slider that will affect the pan, just like the knob does. But we won't need to touch the knob. I've set this to the middle so that that acts as the center of the pan. So right above the sliders, you have this param button, meaning parameters. And under that, you've got FX parameter list and parameter modulation. So every parameter or slider in our effects menu is reflected directly here in this list. So I would like to dynamically affect the pan, so I'm going to select that, and a new window pops open. And it's already checked enable parameter modulation, meaning it is ready to modulate a parameter. And this slider is acting now as a stand-in for the slider down here. So I'm going to let it oscillate, and the perfect tool for oscillation is a low-frequency oscillator. Oscillation you can think of as a back and forth movement. And so you'll see down here we have this oscillating value. And as you can see, our slider down here is now moving along to that value. But it's only hanging out in the positive side above that center line, that 0 line. So if I select centered here for direction, it will now have its center be this line. And you can see it's bouncing from -100 to +100. And the shape of the LFO is a sine or sine wave. So it's going up and down smoothly. I could change that to a square wave. Now it's going to go from the minimum to the maximum and nothing in between, making squares if you were to see this in a time-based display. I could also select saw L, and that's going to ramp all the way down and then jump immediately up and then ramp back down. Saw right does the opposite, and triangle ramps up and down linearly. Lastly, we have random, which will output a random value in an almost Perlin noise type fashion. Not completely random, with some smoothness. So I want this pan to happen back and forth in a constant smooth way. So I'm going to select sine. And I'd like to take down the speed so it's not panning back and forth too much, too fast. And strength is going to determine how much of this wave makes it to the pan slider down here. So if I bring that strength down, it's going to stay around the middle of that slider. But I'll have it go all the way. And phase determines where in time this sine wave began. So if I set it to the middle or 0.5, we're starting the wave offset like a cosine wave. So I'm happy with that, and I'm going to close that. And if I play, you'll now hear that this track is panning back and forth automatically based on the parameters I set in its parameter modulation window. But what if I wanted to have complete control over it, or draw a guiding line to tell an effect or other parameter how to operate? That's possible through automation. So on your track, next to your effects button, there is a button that says trim. And I'll just close this to get it out of the way. And this button pulls up a menu where you can see every parameter associated with your track. So you've got things like volume, pan, mute, your sends, so you can raise and lower the amount of signal going to your receive, in this case our reverb effect, and every single parameter from every other effect. So you can see our EQ has a whole lot of parameters. And so I want this flapping sound to sound like it's something flying closer and farther away. So a very simplistic way of doing that will be to raise and lower the volume. So I'm going to select volume as my envelope, and you'll see it opens up a new area underneath your track with the name of the parameter you have just selected. And you'll notice some sort of colored line, mine in this case is green, and at the beginning of that line is an outline of a circle creating a node on this line. And below the line, you have a semi-transparent fill of that line's color. So if I hover above the line and hold the control button on Windows, Command on Mac, it pulls up this pencil icon. And if I click on the line, it will create a new node. And so because we're affecting the volume parameter, if I drag that node down, and keep in mind there's another node, the default node from the beginning, this track is now going to fade out following that line. Now it's completely muted, but I can also, if I make some new nodes, bring that back up. That, of course, is linear. Oftentimes, that's all you need. But if I wanted the signal to come in and out in some sort of curved way, there are a few options here if you right-click a node and under Set Point Shape. So if I selected Bezier, it would start curving smoothly. I'll zoom in to make that more clear. But I want something completely organic. And if I hold Alt or Option and drag that line, it will make a shaped curve based on what I want. But what if I want something more organic? What if I wanted to draw a line to make something sound more natural, like a bird flapping closer and farther away from you? Well, that pen icon, when you hold Control or Command, isn't just for making nodes, you can draw with it. So if I just click and drag, now this flapping being is flying closer and further away. The louder it gets, the closer it sounds. And that's automation. You can pre-plan either in an exact way or a more natural way how different effects and parameters operate based on the time of your mix. So there are plenty of other effects we can explore, but I'm going to end it here for now. If you've followed along and made an audio track of your own, send them my way. Otherwise, I hope this has given you some better insight on effects, routing, parameter modulation, and automation in Reaper. To conclude, I'm going to play a snippet from the original song and then a snippet from the new song that was clipped in the previous tutorial and now has had effects applied.